The North feared him as a beast until she placed her hand on his fur and he knelt before her. Chapter 1. The Feared Beast. "You missed a spot, worthless girl." The words struck like ice against stone, sharp and unforgiving in the pre-dawn darkness of the northern palace. Lyanna felt them lodge beneath her ribs, familiar as breathing, expected as sunrise. She had spent her whole life hearing variations of the same cruel dismissal, had learned to let them roll off her shoulders like water off granite. She kept her head down, focusing on the intricate marble patterns beneath her raw, chapped hands. The scrub brush moved in steady circles, working soap into the grooves where yesterday's mud and blood had dried. The northern palace never stayed clean for long, not when its master returned from battle with victory carved into his very bones and the scent of death clinging to his massive frame. "The Alpha King returns today," whispered Mira, another servant girl who had paused in her own endless task of polishing silver. Her voice carried that particular mixture of fear and fascination that always surrounded talk of Cale Thorne. "Cook says the border wars are finally over, says he's bringing back trophies." Lyanna's brush stilled for just a moment. She had heard the rumours too, whispered in corners and breathed into shadows when the higher-ranked servants thought no one was listening. The Alpha King of the Northern Territories had spent 3 months crushing rebellion along the eastern borders, and the stories that filtered back spoke of a monster in wolf's clothing who showed no mercy to those who dared challenge his rule. They called him the Beast of the North. The massive double doors at the far end of the great hall creaked open, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lyanna didn't need to look up to know that Lord Commander Hayes had entered. His boots struck the marble with military precision, each step echoing through the cavernous space like a death knell. "All servants to the courtyard," Hayes commanded, his voice cutting through the morning air with brutal efficiency. "The Alpha King approaches. You will show proper respect, or you will find yourselves in the dungeons by nightfall." The other servants scattered like leaves before a storm, abandoning their tasks to rush toward the courtyard where they would line up in perfect rows to welcome their returning king. Lyanna remained on her knees, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn stain, hoping invisibility would protect her, as it always had. "That means you too, girl." Hayes's shadow fell across her like a threat. "Move." She pushed herself to her feet, joints protesting after hours of kneeling on unforgiving stone. Her grey servant's dress hung loose on her thin frame, marking her as one of the lowest-ranked workers in the palace hierarchy. The kind of person who cleaned floors and emptied chamber pots and pretended not to exist when important people walked by. The courtyard buzzed with nervous energy as servants, guards and minor nobles arranged themselves according to rank and station. Lyanna found her place at the very back, behind kitchen maids and stable boys, where she belonged, where she had always belonged. The sound reached them first, a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself, growing stronger with each passing moment until the cobblestones beneath their feet began to vibrate. Horses whinnied nervously in the stables, dogs howled and tucked their tails between their legs. Even the bravest guards shifted uncomfortably, hands moving instinctively to weapon hilts. Then they saw him. Cale Thorne emerged from the forest that bordered the palace grounds, but he was not riding a horse like his men. He was not even in human form. The massive black wolf that padded into the courtyard stood nearly 5 feet at the shoulder, its eyes burning with an intelligence that was utterly, terrifyingly human. Scars crisscrossed his muzzle and flanks, telling stories of battles fought and won through sheer brutal force. The assembled crowd fell silent, not the respectful quiet of subjects greeting their king, but the frozen terror of prey animals faced with an apex predator. The wolf's gaze swept across them with casual indifference, as if cataloguing which ones might run and which ones might fight before he tore them all apart. Lyanna found herself holding her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs with primal fear. She had never seen the Alpha King in his wolf form before. Servants like her were kept far away from such displays of power, hidden in kitchens and laundries where they could pretend the monster was just a man. But he was not just a man. That much was terrifyingly clear. The transformation began without warning. Bones cracked and reformed with sounds like breaking branches. Muscle and sinew stretched and realigned as the massive wolf form condensed and shifted, black fur receding to reveal bronze skin marked by battle scars. Within moments, Kyle Thorne stood before them in human form, 6.5 feet of raw power wrapped in leather and steel. His dark hair fell in waves to his shoulders, framing a face that might have been handsome if not for the coldness in his storm-grey eyes. Those eyes held no warmth, no recognition of the people gathered before him as anything more than tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. When he spoke, his voice carried the same dangerous edge that had been present in his wolf's growl. 3 months, he said, the words falling into the courtyard like stones into still water. 3 months to remind the eastern provinces why they kneel to the north. Some of them required more convincing than others. He gestured to his men, who were dragging leather sacks from their horses. The sacks clinked with the sound of metal against metal, and dark stains had soaked through the material in places. Trophies, Lyanna realised with sick certainty. The heads of enemy leaders who had thought they could challenge the beast of the north and live to tell the tale. "Let this serve as a reminder," Kyle continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd. "I am not a merciful king. I am not a patient king. I am the wolf at your door, and the only thing standing between you and the chaos beyond our borders. You live because I allow it. You breathe because I will it. Never forget that truth." A murmur of fearful agreement rippled through the crowd. "Yes, my lord. Of course, Alpha King. Whatever you command." The same words that had been spoken to generations of northern rulers, but never with quite this level of genuine terror. Lyanna kept her eyes fixed on the cobblestones, willing herself to remain invisible as she had learned to do over 20 years of existing on the margins of palace life. But something made her look up, some inexplicable pull that she couldn't resist, as if a string connected to her very soul had been tugged by an unseen hand. Her gaze met Kyle Thorne's across the courtyard, and the world tilted. Those storm-grey eyes locked onto hers with sudden, startling intensity. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, she forgot how to breathe, forgot her own name, forgot everything except the impossible recognition that flashed between them like lightning in a clear sky. She saw surprise flicker across his hard features, saw his nostrils flare as if catching an unfamiliar scent, saw his entire body go rigid with the kind of alert stillness that preceded either flight or violence. Then someone moved between them, breaking the connection, and Lyanna gasped as if surfacing from deep water. Her knees threatened to buckle. Her hands shook as she pressed them against her chest, trying to calm the wild hammering of her heart. What had just happened? What was that impossible moment of connection with the most dangerous man in the kingdom? And why did every instinct she possessed scream that her life had just changed forever? Kyle Thorne was already turning away, striding toward the palace entrance with his usual predatory grace. But Lyanna could have sworn she felt his attention lingering on her, like a brand against her skin, even as he disappeared into the shadows of the great hall. The crowd began to disperse, servants and nobles alike eager to put distance between themselves and their fearsome king. But Lyanna remained frozen in place, one hand pressed to her chest, where something deep inside her had awakened at the sight of storm-grey eyes. She had spent her whole life being invisible, being nothing, being nobody worth remembering. But the beast of the north had seen her, and somehow she knew that nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 10. The Crescent Moon Battle. The ancient stone circle stood empty under the full moon's silver gaze, its weathered monoliths bearing witness to countless challenges fought and settled according to laws older than memory. Tonight, those stones would see history written in blood and starlight, as two women fought for the right to stand beside the most powerful alpha in the northern kingdoms. Nobles from both courts lined the circle's perimeter, their faces illuminated by torches that cast dancing shadows across the ritual ground. Lord Blackthorn stood with his southern allies, confident satisfaction etched into every line of his weathered features. Elder Magnus remained close to Kyle, his ancient hands clasped tightly as he watched the woman he had helped awaken prepare to fight for her very survival. And at the circle's heart, Lady Isadora Blackthorn waited like death given beautiful form. She had eschewed formal gowns for this battle, instead donning leather armour that had been dyed midnight black to match her raven hair. Silver claws extended from specially crafted gauntlets, each one razor-sharp and gleaming with something that made the moonlight seem to recoil. Poison, Lyanna realised with sick certainty. Isadora intended to end this challenge quickly and permanently. "Are you ready to die for your pretensions, little servant?" Isadora called across the circle, her voice carrying clearly in the charged night air. "Or would you prefer to withdraw your claim and return to the kitchens where you belong?" Lyanna stepped into the circle's centre, her own appearance a study in contrasts to her opponent's deadly preparation. She wore simple white leather that seemed to glow in the moonlight, and the crescent mark on her palm blazed with silver radiance that responded to the moon's pull. No weapons adorned her hands. She would fight as her ancestors had, with tooth and claw and the power that ran in her royal blood. "I am ready to claim what is mine by right," Lyanna replied, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her. The moon-crowned bloodline bows to no pretender, regardless of how prettily she threatens. Isadora's laugh was like breaking glass. Bold words from someone who learned of her supposed heritage less than a week ago. Let's see if your mysterious bloodline can save you from 3 decades of combat training. The formal words of challenge echoed across the ancient stones as Elder Magnus raised his voice in ritual invocation. "By the laws of our ancestors, by the authority of moon and star, let this challenge be witnessed and its outcome accepted by all who stand here tonight. The combat will continue until one yields, flees, or dies. Begin." Isadora moved like liquid lightning, crossing the distance between them with inhuman speed. Her poisoned claws whistled through the air where Lyanna's throat had been a heartbeat before, and only instincts she didn't know she possessed saved her from immediate death. The transformation came without conscious thought, her human form dissolving in a cascade of silver light as her awakened wolf burst free. She landed on 4 legs with feline grace, her ethereal fur gleaming like starlight as she circled her opponent with predatory patience. Isadora's own shift followed immediately after, revealing the truth that she had hidden from the courts for years. Her wolf was massive and wrong, larger than any natural beast, and bearing fur so black it seemed to absorb light. But worst of all were her eyes, not the golden or silver of true-born wolves, but burning red that spoke of power gained through darker means than bloodline inheritance. "Demon-touched," Magnus breathed from the circle's edge, his voice carrying horror and sudden understanding. "She's bound herself to shadow magic. That's how she's gained such size and strength." The revelation sent murmurs of shock through the assembled witnesses, but Lyanna had no time to process its implications. Isadora lunged with jaws that dripped shadow poison, her demon-enhanced strength driving her forward like a battering ram of teeth and fury. Lyanna barely dodged the attack, feeling corrupted claws rake along her ribs as she twisted away from certain death. Pain lanced through her side, but the wounds glowed with silver light as her moon-crown heritage fought against the shadow poison, trying to invade her system. They circled each other in the ancient dance of predators, each looking for the opening that would end the fight in her favour. Isadora had size and trained viciousness on her side, her demon-touched nature granting her strength that no ordinary wolf could match. But Lyanna carried something far more dangerous, the accumulated power of centuries, the blessed heritage of queens who had ruled when magic flowed freely through the world. The battle became a whirlwind of silver and shadow, two forces that had been opposed since the dawn of creation, now settling their ancient rivalry through tooth and claw. Isidora fought with calculated brutality, using her superior size to drive Lyanna back against the standing stones, seeking to trap her where poison claws could finish what they had started. But as the full moon reached its zenith, something extraordinary began to happen. Light poured from Lyanna's silver fur, not the gentle glow she had manifested before, but blazing radiance that turned night into day. The crescent mark on her palm, visible even in wolf form, burst into flames of pure moonlight that made Isidora shriek and stumble backward. "Impossible!" Lord Blackthorn snarled from the crowd. "No bloodline carries power like that. It's unnatural." But Magnus understood what they were witnessing, and his voice rang out with prophetic certainty. "Behold the true heir of the moon-crowned throne, Lyanna, daughter of Luna, blessed by Selene herself. The silver dawn rises at last." Power coursed through Lyanna's transformed body as the full weight of her heritage made itself known. She was not just the descendant of ancient royalty. She was the culmination of centuries of careful magical preparation, the chosen vessel for power that had been building and concentrating through generation after generation of hidden bloodline. She was the weapon that Queen Selene had forged with her dying breath, designed specifically to break the curse that had been laid upon Aldrich Thorne's descendants. Isidora sensed the shift immediately, her demon-enhanced instincts screaming warnings as true royal magic blazed to life before her. She attacked with desperate fury, knowing that her only chance lay in overwhelming Lyanna before the awakened power could be brought fully to bear. The two wolves crashed together in the circle's centre, silver light and shadow poison warring for dominance. Isidora's poisoned claws found their mark, opening deep wounds along Lyanna's flanks that should have brought swift death. But the moon-crown magic burned the corruption from her system, even as it tried to take hold, healing damage faster than it could be inflicted. In desperation, Isidora called upon the full power of her demon bond, her form swelling with shadow magic until she towered over Lyanna like a creature from nightmare. Red eyes blazed with borrowed power, and when she opened her jaws, darkness poured out like liquid death. But Lyanna met darkness with light. Silver fire erupted from her throat in a howl that shattered the night itself, a sound that carried the voices of every moon-crowned queen who had ever lived. The beam of pure moonlight struck Isidora's centre mass, and the demon-touched wolf screamed as sacred power burned through her corrupted form. The shadow magic that had enhanced her strength turned against her as it met its ancient enemy. Darkness fed on light, but when that light carried the concentrated will of centuries, even demons learned to fear. Isidora's borrowed power abandoned her in cascading failure, leaving behind only a woman who had traded her soul for temporary strength. She crashed to the ground in human form, her perfect features twisted with agony as the demon bond's severance tore through her system. When she tried to rise, to continue the fight that had already been decided, silver light wrapped around her like chains of starfire. "Yield!" Lyanna commanded, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke directly to the soul. "Your power is broken, your magic corrupted. Yield or face the judgment that awaits all who traffic with demons." Isidora stared up at her with eyes that held madness and defeat in equal measure. The perfect noblewoman was gone, replaced by something desperate and broken that had gambled everything on dark power and lost. "I yield," she whispered, the words torn from her throat like pieces of her shattered pride. "The challenge is yours, Silver Dawn. The throne is yours." A cheer rose from the assembled witnesses as the implications of Lyanna's victory became clear. Not just triumph in single combat, but the restoration of a bloodline that predated the current kingdom, the return of magic that had been thought lost forever. But Lyanna's attention was focused elsewhere. At the circle's edge, Kyle stood transfixed as the curse that had plagued his bloodline for 3 centuries finally shattered under the impact of her victory. She could see it in the way his shoulders straightened, in the peace that settled over his features as the beast madness released its hold on his soul at last. The prophecy was fulfilled. The silver dawn had broken the chains of shadow, and the northern throne had found its true queen. As dawn approached and the witnesses began to disperse, making plans for coronations and new alliances that would reshape the political landscape of the kingdom, Lyanna remained in the ancient circle. The battle was won, but the real work was just beginning. She had reclaimed her heritage, defeated her rival, and broken a curse that had lasted 3 centuries. But most importantly, she had found the one person in all the world who saw her not as a servant or a weapon or a political necessity, but simply as the woman he loved. The silver dawn had risen at last, and the darkness would never again hold dominion over the northern throne. Chapter 11. The crown claimed. The great hall of the northern palace had been transformed into something from legend. Moonlight streamed through the vast windows, no longer filtered by glass, but flowing freely through openings that had been carved wider to welcome Luna's blessing. Silver banners bearing the restored moon-crowned seal hung alongside the northern wolf standards, their ethereal glow turning the ancient stone into something that seemed carved from starlight itself. At the hall's heart stood the altar that Magnus had constructed according to texts older than memory, moonstone and silver arranged in patterns that sang with power, surrounded by candles that burned with flames the colour of captured starlight. This was where the final ritual would take place, where 3 centuries of curse and suffering would finally come to an end. Lyanna knelt before the altar in robes of pure white silk that seemed to glow with inner light, the moon-crown pendant now openly displayed at her throat as her rightful heritage. The crescent mark on her palm blazed like a silver star, responding to the proximity of sacred stones that recognized her royal blood. Beside her, Kyle waited in formal attire that had been hastily modified to accommodate the ceremony that no one had expected to witness. His storm-grey eyes never left her face, drinking in the sight of the woman who had transformed from invisible servant to acknowledged queen in the space of a single week. The assembled witnesses filled every available space in the great hall, lords and ladies from both northern and southern courts, common folk who had been granted entry to witness this historic moment, and representatives from kingdoms across the realm who had arrived to see if the legends were truly coming to pass. Elder Magnus stood before them all, his weathered face radiant with joy and vindication as he prepared to conduct the ceremony he had dreamed of for decades. In his hands he held the Codex of Ancient Rites, its pages open to rituals that had not been performed since the fall of the Moon-Crown Kingdom. "We gather beneath Luna's blessing," Magnus began, in the formal cadence of high ceremony, "to witness the restoration of a bloodline thought lost, the breaking of a curse that has plagued the northern throne for 3 centuries, and the union of 2 souls destined to rule as one." He raised his hands to the moonlight streaming through the windows, and his voice carried the authority of someone speaking for the gods themselves. "Lyanna, daughter of Luna, heir to the moon-crowned throne, descendant of Queen Selene, do you accept the burden and blessing of your heritage? Do you claim the power that flows in your royal blood?" "I do," Lyanna replied, her voice clear and strong despite the magnitude of what was happening. The pendant at her throat flared with brilliant light, and several witnesses gasped as silver fire danced across her skin. "Then rise and take your place as the silver dawn prophesied in ancient texts." Magnus gestured to the moonstone altar, where a circlet of silver and starlight waited to crown the rightful queen. Let the curse-breaking begin." The ritual that followed was unlike anything the witnesses had ever seen. As Magnus spoke the words of power in the old tongue, light began to pour from Lyanna's transformed form. Not the gentle glow she had manifested before, but blazing radiance that turned the great hall into a constellation of silver stars. The curse that had bound Kyle's bloodline responded immediately, rising to the surface of his skin in patterns of shadow that writhed and fought against the approaching dissolution. 3 centuries of accumulated darkness made its final stand, clinging to the northern throne with desperate fury. But it was no match for the power that flowed through Lyanna's royal blood. She moved to stand behind Kyle, her hands coming to rest on his shoulders where the curse marks were darkest. The moment her skin touched his, silver fire erupted along the shadow patterns, burning through corruption that had seemed permanent only moments before. Kyle gasped as pain beyond description lanced through his system, not the agony of curse-driven transformation, but the exquisite torment of poison being drawn from a wound that had festered for lifetimes. He could feel the beast madness being pulled from his very bones, centuries of accumulated rage and violence dissolving under Lyanna's purifying touch. "Let the chains be broken," Magnus commanded, his voice echoing with divine authority. "Let the shadows flee before the silver dawn's light. By moon and star, by the authority of the royal bloodline, let this curse be severed forever." The climax came in a cascade of silver lightning that illuminated the entire palace. Chains of shadow stuff became visible around Kyle's form, binding him to the curse that had claimed his ancestors. And then those chains shattered like glass under hammer blows, dissolving into motes of light that spiraled upward to disappear through the open windows. For the first time in his adult life, Cale Thorne was completely free. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. The lines of constant pain that had bracketed his mouth vanished entirely. The shadows that had haunted his storm-grey eyes lifted, leaving behind a clarity that seemed to glow with inner light. When he stood and turned to face Lyanna, he moved with the fluid grace of someone no longer fighting a battle within his own soul. "It's done," he said, wonder and disbelief warring in his voice. "I can feel it. The curse is gone. The beast madness, the rage, the constant struggle to maintain control, all of it, gone." Tears streamed down Lyanna's face as she reached up to cup his cheek, feeling the difference in him through their mate bond. The connection between them, which had always carried undertones of his pain and struggle, now hummed with pure harmony. "Now," Magnus said with deep satisfaction, "let us complete what we began. By the authority vested in me as Elder of the Northern Court and Keeper of Ancient Laws, I pronounce you mated according to the sacred traditions. Cale Thorne, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and Lyanna, Queen of the Moon-Crown bloodline, Silver Dawn of Prophecy, let your bond be witnessed and blessed by all who stand here tonight." The mate ceremony that followed was brief but profound. No political manoeuvring, no calculated alliances, just 2 souls acknowledging what had always been true, that they were 2 halves of the same whole, destined to rule together or not at all. When Cale placed the silver circlet on Lyanna's head, crowning her as his equal and queen, the assembled witnesses erupted in celebration that could be heard throughout the palace grounds. The Moon-Crown bloodline was restored, the northern curse was broken, and 2 kingdoms that had been separate for centuries were united once more under the blessing of ancient magic. But as the formal ceremony concluded and the celebration began, practical matters demanded immediate attention. Lord Blackthorn and his faction had fled during the night, unwilling to face the consequences of their daughter's demon binding and the political upheaval that would surely follow. Messages needed to be sent to neighbouring kingdoms, explaining the dramatic changes that had taken place and the new alliances that would reshape the political landscape. Most importantly, the question of succession and the continuation of both bloodlines needed to be addressed. It was Lady Catherine, one of the few southern nobles who had remained after Isadora's defeat, who finally broached the subject that everyone was thinking about, but no one quite dared to voice. "Your Majesties," she said with careful diplomacy, approaching the high table where Kyle and Lyanna had taken their places as acknowledged rulers, "the kingdom rejoices in your union and the restoration of ancient bloodlines, but surely you understand that your subjects will wish to know, that is to say, they will hope for news of an heir to secure the succession." Lyanna felt heat bloom in her cheeks at the implication, but Kyle's hand found hers beneath the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of support and shared understanding. "The succession will be secured in due time," he replied, with the calm authority of a king who had learned to navigate political necessity. "Our union is barely hours old, but we understand the importance of providing stability for our people." Lady Catherine smiled with obvious relief. "Of course, Your Majesty. The kingdom is simply eager to celebrate every blessing that comes from this miraculous restoration." As the feast continued around them, and musicians played melodies that had been composed centuries ago to honour the Moon Crown royalty, Lyanna found herself thinking about the future that stretched before them. A week ago, she had been scrubbing floors and dodging cruel words from those who considered her beneath notice. Tonight she wore a crown and sat beside the most powerful man in the northern kingdoms, acknowledged as his equal and queen. The transformation was so complete, so overwhelming, that part of her still expected to wake up in her narrow servant's bed and discover that all of this had been an impossible dream. But the mate bond that connected her to Kyle thrummed with steady warmth, and the weight of the silver circlet on her brow was reassuringly real. This was her life now. These were her people, her responsibilities, her destiny finally claimed after 20 years of hiding. "Are you happy?" Kyle asked quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear over the celebration surrounding them. Lyanna turned to meet his storm-grey gaze, seeing her own wonder reflected in his eyes. "I'm terrified," she admitted with an honesty that would have been impossible a week ago. "I don't know how to be a queen, how to rule a kingdom, how to navigate the politics that will come with uniting our bloodlines." "And yet?" he prompted gently. She smiled then, the expression transforming her face with radiant joy. "And yet, I've never been happier in my entire life. For the first time since I can remember, I know who I am. I know where I belong. I know that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Kyle lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to the palm where her crescent mark continued to glow with soft silver light. "Then we'll learn together," he promised, "queen and king, mate and mate, facing whatever comes as partners in all things." Outside the great hall, dawn was breaking over the northern palace, painting the sky in shades of silver and gold that seemed to echo the colours of their united bloodlines. But for the first time in either of their lives, neither of them was thinking about the duties that daylight would bring. They were thinking about the future they would build together, and the love that had transformed them both from broken individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts. The curse was broken. The bloodlines were united, and the silver dawn had finally claimed her rightful place beside the king who had been waiting for her all his life. Chapter 12. Silver Dawn. 6 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and the northern palace bore little resemblance to the cold fortress it had once been. Tapestries in silver and midnight blue adorned walls that had known only military efficiency, their ethereal glow softening stone corridors that had echoed with the harsh commands of soldiers. Gardens bloomed where once only bare courtyards had stretched, their flowers responding to the moon crown magic that now flowed freely through the palace grounds. From her place on the balcony overlooking the kingdom she had never imagined she would rule, Queen Lyanna watched the sunrise paint the world in shades of gold and rose. The silver circlet that had become as familiar as breathing rested easily on her brow, no longer feeling like the impossible weight it had seemed on that first night when everything changed. Below in the courtyard, she could see the morning training sessions that had become a cornerstone of their united kingdom. Northern warriors learned the fluid combat techniques that had once been exclusive to the Moon Crown bloodline, while scholars from the restored royal libraries taught ancient magics to those with the heritage to wield them. Integration, not conquest, that had been the foundation upon which they built this new world. "You're thinking again," Kyle observed from the balcony's entrance, his voice carrying the warm affection that never failed to make her heart skip. "I can feel it through the bond." Lyanna turned to smile at her mate and king, still struck by the transformation that had overtaken him in the months since his curse was broken. Gone were the lines of constant pain, the shadows that had haunted his eyes, the rigid tension that had marked every movement. In their place was a man at peace with himself and his destiny, confident in ways that had nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with the simple knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged. "I was remembering," she corrected, moving into the circle of his arms with the easy intimacy that had grown between them. 6 months ago, I was scrubbing floors and believing I was nothing more than an unwanted orphan. Now—" She gestured to the kingdom spread out below them, to the palace that hummed with magic and prosperity, to the life they had built together from the ashes of ancient curses and political necessity. "Now you rule a kingdom that spans 2 territories, command magic that hasn't been seen in centuries, and carry the heir to both our bloodlines," Kale finished, his hand moving to rest protectively over the gentle curve of her belly where their child grew. The pregnancy announcement had come 3 months after their mating, bringing joy to a kingdom that had already experienced more miracles than most saw in a lifetime. The child would carry both the Moon Crown heritage and the Northern royal line, uniting bloodlines that had been separated for centuries and ensuring that neither would ever again face extinction. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never found the courage to reach out that first day in your chambers," Lyanna mused, leaning back against his chest as they watched their kingdom wake to another day of peace and prosperity. "We would have found each other eventually," Kyle replied with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned to trust in destiny. "The mate bond doesn't accept substitutes, and the prophecy would have found a way to fulfill itself. But I'm grateful we didn't have to wait any longer than we did." A soft knock at the balcony doors interrupted their peaceful morning, and Elder Magnus appeared with the satisfied expression he had worn almost constantly since the night of their mating ceremony. In his hands he carried a leather portfolio that Lyanna recognised as containing reports from across their expanded kingdom. "Your Majesties," he said, with the formal courtesy that masked deep affection. "The morning reports have arrived. The harvest projections exceed all expectations. It seems the Moon Crown magic has enhanced crop yields across both territories. The trade negotiations with the Eastern Kingdoms are proceeding favourably, and representatives from 3 neighbouring realms have requested audiences to discuss potential alliances." "All good news, I hope?" Lyanna asked, though she could read the answer in Magnus's pleased expression. "Very good news, Your Majesty. It appears that word of your unique heritage has spread beyond our borders. Several kingdoms are interested in forming alliances with the only realm to successfully restore a lost royal bloodline and break a centuries-old curse." Kyle accepted the reports with practised ease, his eyes scanning the documents with the efficiency of a ruler who had learned to balance the demands of 2 kingdoms. But Lyanna could feel his contentment through their bond. This was the kind of problem he was happy to have, the sort of diplomatic success that spoke to stability rather than crisis. "There is one other matter," Magnus continued, with the careful tone he used when delivering news of particular significance. "Lady Catherine has sent word from the Southern Territories. Lord Blackthorn's remaining holdings have formally surrendered, and his allies have agreed to recognise your authority. The consolidation is complete." The news should have brought satisfaction, but Lyanna found herself thinking of Isadora instead. The former noblewoman had survived her defeat in the challenge circle, but the severing of her demon bond had left her broken in ways that went far beyond the physical. She had been exiled to a remote monastery in the mountains, where she would spend the rest of her life in contemplation of the choices that had led to her downfall. "Any word on her condition?" Leanna asked quietly. Magnus's expression softened with something that might have been pity. "The abbess reports that she is adapting to her new circumstances. The demon bond's severance left her with no memory of the dark magic she wielded, and she shows no signs of the madness we feared might result from such a traumatic magical separation. In many ways she is like a child again, learning to see the world without the corruption that had tainted her perspective for so long." It was more mercy than Isadora had deserved, Leanna knew, but she had learned that true strength sometimes meant choosing compassion over vengeance. The woman who had tried to kill her was gone, replaced by someone who would never again pose a threat to anyone. "And the other lords who fled?" Kyle asked. "Scattered to various courts where they are attempting to rebuild their fortunes and influence. None pose any immediate threat to the kingdom, and most seem more interested in preserving what remains of their holdings than in causing further trouble." As Magnus departed to attend to his many duties, Leanna found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this place of peace and prosperity. 6 months ago she had been nobody, invisible, worthless in the eyes of everyone around her, including herself. But that woman felt like a stranger now, someone she had known in a half-remembered dream. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots had been real, but she had also been incomplete. A queen in hiding, a power suppressed, a destiny delayed, but never truly denied. "Do you miss it?" Kale asked suddenly, his voice soft with understanding. "The simplicity of your old life, the freedom from responsibility that came with being invisible?" Leanna considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked about her feelings regarding their transformed circumstances. It would be easy to claim that she had never looked back, that she had embraced her new role without any regrets or moments of doubt, but that wouldn't be honest, and their relationship was built on truth in all its forms. "Sometimes," she admitted, "there was a certain peace in believing that I didn't matter, that my choices wouldn't affect anyone beyond myself. The weight of responsibility for an entire kingdom can be overwhelming when I let myself think about it too much. And yet," she smiled, the expression transforming her face with the same radiant joy that had marked their mating ceremony, "and yet I've never been more myself than I am right now. The girl who scrubbed floors was hiding from her true nature. This woman, the queen who stands beside you, is who I was always meant to become." Kyle's arms tightened around her, and she felt his love and pride flowing through their bond like warm honey. "When I stopped believing I was worthless," she continued, "when I started accepting that I deserved more than invisible servitude, that's when everything changed. Not when I learned about my bloodline or discovered my magic, when I chose to believe that I mattered." "You've always mattered," Kyle said fiercely. "Even when you were hiding in plain sight, even when the world tried to convince you otherwise, you mattered. You were always worthy of love, of respect, of the crown you wear now." The child in her womb stirred, as if responding to the emotion in their parents' voices, and Leanna placed her hand over Kyle's where it rested on her belly. Their son or daughter would grow up knowing their worth from the very beginning, surrounded by love and magic and the unshakable knowledge that they were exactly who they were meant to be. "What do you think they'll call this story?" Leanna asked, as the sun climbed higher, bathing their kingdom in golden light that seemed to promise endless prosperity. When the bards sing of the servant girl who became a queen and the cursed king who found his salvation, "They'll call it impossible," Kyle replied, with the satisfied smile of a man whose impossible dreams had all come true. "They'll say it's too perfect, too much like a fairy tale to be believed. But we'll know better. We'll know that the impossible happens every day to people who refuse to accept that they're powerless to change their fate." As they stood together on the balcony of the palace that had become their home, watching over the kingdom they ruled as equals and partners, Lyanna felt a profound sense of completion settle over her. The servant girl was gone, transformed into something greater than she had ever imagined possible. The queen remained, confident in her power and secure in the love that had made her transformation possible. The silver dawn had risen at last, bringing light to a kingdom that had known too much darkness and hope to people who had forgotten how to dream. And this was only the beginning. Their story would be told for generations, the tale of two broken souls who found wholeness in each other, of ancient magic restored and impossible curses broken, of love that transcended duty and destiny that refused to be denied. But most importantly, it would be remembered as the story of a woman who discovered that she had never been worthless at all. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to shine. Chapter 2. The Ancient Curse. The chamber deep beneath the northern palace had not seen sunlight in 3 centuries. Elder Magnus descended the worn stone steps with careful precision, his ancient bones protesting each downward movement. The air grew colder with every step, thick with the weight of old magic and older secrets. Cale Thorne waited in the shadows at the bottom of the stairs, his massive frame coiled with restless energy. Even in human form, he radiated the barely contained violence of his wolf, pacing the confines of the underground sanctuary like a caged predator. The torches mounted on the walls flickered in response to his agitation, casting dancing shadows across walls carved with symbols that predated the kingdom itself. "You're late," Kyle growled without turning around. His voice echoed off the stone, amplified by the chamber's ancient acoustics until it sounded like the rumble of distant thunder. "I am exactly on time," Magnus replied, with the calm authority of someone who had served 3 generations of northern rulers. "You are simply impatient. The curse makes you so." Kyle's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Don't speak to me about the curse, old man. Not today." But Magnus had not lived to see 93 winters by backing down from difficult conversations. He moved past the Alpha King to the altar at the chamber's centre, where moonlight filtered through a single crystal embedded in the ceiling above. The pale light revealed the truth that Cale tried so desperately to hide from the world above. Fresh scars covered the Alpha King's arms and chest, deep gouges that could only have been made by claws, his own claws. The wounds were already healing with supernatural speed, but Magnus could see the pattern they formed, the same pattern that had appeared on his father, and his grandfather, and every male heir to the northern throne for the past 300 years. "Show me," Magnus commanded quietly. Kyle turned then, his storm-grey eyes blazing with fury and something darker, something that looked dangerously close to despair. "You know what you'll see." "Show me anyway." With movements sharp with suppressed rage, Kyle stripped off his leather vest and let it fall to the stone floor. The scars on his torso told a story of violence that no enemy had inflicted. The wounds formed a spiral pattern across his chest, each mark corresponding to the phases of the moon when his control slipped away entirely. Magnus approached with the reverence of a healer examining a terminal patient. His gnarled fingers traced the air above the scars, never quite touching, while he murmured words in the old tongue, the ancient language of the moon-blessed bloodlines, spoken when the world was young and magic flowed like rivers through the land. "It's accelerating," Magnus said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. 3 months ago, you lost yourself for 6 hours during the full moon. This time... Kyle's jaw clenched until Magnus could hear his teeth grinding together. 14 hours! I came back to consciousness in the eastern forest with blood under my claws and no memory of how it got there. The admission hung between them like a death sentence. Magnus had known this day would come, had seen it written in the stars and whispered by the wind through the ancient trees, but knowing a thing and witnessing its arrival were entirely different experiences. "Tell me the prophecy again," Kyle demanded, though they both knew he could recite it by heart. "Tell me there's still hope." Magnus moved to the stone altar where leather-bound tomes lay open to pages yellow with age. The words were written in silver ink that seemed to glow in the moonlight, as if the prophecy itself possessed a life of its own. "When the Wolf King's bloodline bears the curse of endless night," Magnus read aloud, his voice taking on the formal cadence of ancient ritual. "When beast madness threatens to consume the throne, when the howling darkness offers no reprieve, then shall the silver dawn break the chains of shadow. She who bears the crescent mark and carries royal blood, she who commands the ancient power of the moon-blessed line, she alone can sever the bonds that bind wolf to beast and return light to the northern crown." Kyle laughed, but there was no humour in the sound, only bitter acceptance of an impossible fate. "A fairy tale, Magnus. Pretty words written by dead mystics who never lived to see their prophecies proven false." "Your ancestor didn't think it was a fairy tale when he betrayed the Moon Crown Princess," Magnus replied sharply. "Aldrich Thorne knew exactly what he was doing when he murdered Queen Selene to steal her kingdom. He understood the consequences of his actions." The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Kyle's eyes began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the torches on the walls. His wolf was rising to the surface, responding to the mention of the ancient betrayal that had doomed their bloodline. "My ancestor is 3 centuries dead," Kyle snarled. "His crimes are not mine to bear." "The curse disagrees." Magnus turned the page of the ancient tome, revealing an illustration that made Kyle's breath catch in his throat. The image showed a silver wolf, with eyes like starlight, standing over a kneeling black wolf whose head was bowed in submission. Between them, chains of shadow were breaking apart in a cascade of moonlight. "Queen Selene's dying curse was specific," Magnus continued relentlessly. "Every male heir of Aldrich's line would carry the beast madness, losing more of their humanity with each passing generation, until one arose who would be forced to choose between the crown and his sanity, between his kingdom and his soul." "Unless the Silver Dawn comes," Kyle finished wearily. "Unless a princess from a bloodline that was wiped out 300 years ago somehow appears to break chains that have held for longer than most kingdoms have existed." Magnus closed the tome with a sound like thunder. "The Moon Crown bloodline was not wiped out, Kyle. It was hidden." The words hit Kyle like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his wolf surging so close to the surface that his fingernails began to elongate into claws. "What did you say?" "Queen Selene had a younger sister, Princess Luna. When Aldrich's forces overran the Moon Crown capital, Luna fled north with her infant daughter. They disappeared into the frozen wastes, and most assumed they perished in the winter storms." Kyle's transformation was beginning, despite his efforts to control it. His bones cracked as they prepared to reshape themselves. His spine arched with the pain of impending change. "Most assumed." "I have spent 30 years researching the old bloodlines, following traces of moon-blessed magic wherever it might lead. 3 months ago, while you were fighting in the eastern provinces, I finally found what I was looking for." Magnus pulled a second tome from the altar, this one bound in silver leather that seemed to pulse with inner light. The pages fell open to reveal genealogical charts that stretched back centuries, bloodlines branching and merging in patterns too complex for mortal minds to easily follow. But one line stood out from all the rest, a silver thread that traced from Princess Luna through generations of hidden descendants, each one carrying the dormant power of the Moon Crown bloodline. The thread ended with a name written in fresh ink, Lyanna. No family name, no noble title, just a single word that made Kyle's heart stop beating for several crucial seconds. "The servant girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own laboured breathing. "The one from the courtyard." Magnus nodded gravely. She doesn't know what she is. Her grandmother made sure of that before she died, suppressing the girl's power so completely that even she is unaware of her true nature. But the bloodline is there, Kyle. The Silver Dawn walks among us, scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots while carrying the power to save your very soul. Kyle's transformation halted abruptly as shock overrode the curse's demands. He stood frozen in the space between human and wolf, his body caught in the terrible limbo of incomplete change. "She felt it," he said suddenly. "When our eyes met in the courtyard, she felt the recognition. I saw it in her face." "The mate bond," Magnus confirmed. "Your wolf knew what she was before your human mind could accept it. It always does." The implications crashed over Kyle like an avalanche. The curse could be broken, his bloodline could be saved, but only if he could convince a servant girl who knew nothing of her heritage to risk everything for a man she had every reason to fear. "There's more," Magnus said quietly, and something in his tone made Kyle's blood run cold. "The full moon rises in 7 days. If the curse is not broken by then—" "I won't come back," Kyle finished. "The beast will take over permanently." Magnus inclined his head in confirmation. 7 days, Kyle. 7 days to discover if 300 years of suffering can finally come to an end. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairs above. Light footsteps, quick and nervous, accompanied by the rustle of rough fabric. A servant, most likely, sent to inform the Alpha King of some mundane palace business that couldn't wait until morning. But Kyle's enhanced senses caught something else. A scent that made his wolf rear up in recognition and desperate longing. Clean soap and lavender water, but underneath it all, something wild and ancient that called to every primal instinct he possessed. Lyanna had come looking for him, and she had no idea that her entire world was about to change forever. Chapter 3. Invisible Bonds. The Alpha King's private chambers were forbidden territory for someone like Lyanna. She had never set foot beyond the heavy oak doors that guarded Kale Thorne's personal domain, had never been trusted with tasks that brought her into contact with anything more valuable than kitchen scraps and soiled linens. But head housekeeper Meredith had been desperate this morning. 3 chambermaids down with fever, and the Alpha King's rooms in desperate need of attention after his return from the border wars. When Meredith's sharp gaze had fallen on Lyanna scrubbing the hallway floors, duty had trumped protocol. "You'll touch nothing but dust and linens," Meredith had commanded in her voice, like grinding stone. "You'll speak to no one, you'll be invisible, as you always are, and if you break so much as a candlestick, I'll have you whipped before sunset." Now Lyanna stood before those forbidden doors, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear of punishment. Something else drove her pulse to this desperate tempo, something that had been building since yesterday's impossible moment in the courtyard when storm-grey eyes had looked directly into her soul. She pressed her palm against the cold wood and pushed. The chamber beyond took her breath away. Where the rest of the palace favoured cold stone and military efficiency, Kale Thorne's private sanctuary revealed a man of surprising complexity. Rich tapestries in deep blues and silvers covered the walls, depicting scenes of wolves running beneath star-filled skies. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold now but surrounded by comfortable chairs that spoke of long nights spent in solitary contemplation. But it was the books that made Lyanna forget to breathe. Shelves lined every available wall space, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked ancient beyond measure. She had never seen so many books in one place, had never imagined that anyone could own such a treasure trove of knowledge. Her fingers itched to touch the worn spines, to discover what secrets lay hidden within pages that looked older than the kingdom itself. She forced herself to remember why she was here. Dust, linens, invisible service that left no trace of her presence. She moved through the chamber like a ghost, cleaning surfaces that barely needed cleaning, straightening objects that were already perfectly arranged. but the books called to her. One volume in particular seemed to glow in the morning light that filtered through the tall windows. It sat apart from the others on a small reading table beside the cold fireplace, open to a page covered with symbols that seemed to shift and dance when she wasn't looking directly at them. Leanna glanced toward the door. The Alpha King had ridden out before dawn to inspect the northern watchtowers and wouldn't return until evening. Meredith wouldn't check on her for hours. What harm could it do to look at a single page? She approached the book like it might bite her, every instinct screaming that this was dangerous territory for someone of her station. But curiosity proved stronger than caution, and she found herself leaning over the open pages, trying to decipher the strange symbols that decorated the yellowed parchment. The moment her gaze focused on the text, the symbols began to make sense, not in any language she had ever learned, but with the deep recognition that sometimes came in dreams, as if the knowledge had always lived in her bones, waiting for the right moment to surface. "Ancient binding rituals of the moon-blessed bloodlines," she whispered, reading aloud without conscious thought. "Methods for breaking curses that bind wolf to beast, severing the chains that—" The words died on her lips as footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond. Heavy boots, moving with predatory precision toward the chamber doors. Cale Thorne had returned early. Leanna spun away from the book, her heart leaping into her throat as panic flooded her system. She grabbed her cleaning supplies and moved toward the far side of the room, trying to look busy with a tapestry that needed no attention whatsoever. The doors burst open with enough force to rattle the hinges. Cale Thorne filled the doorway like a storm front, his massive frame radiating tension and barely controlled fury. His dark hair was dishevelled from riding, and mud splattered his leather coat, but it was his eyes that made Leanna's breath catch. Those storm-grey depths burned with an intensity that seemed to see straight through her attempts at invisibility. "What," he said in a voice like winter thunder, "are you doing in my chambers?" Leanna's mouth went dry. She clutched her cleaning cloth like a shield, acutely aware that she was alone with the most dangerous man in the kingdom. "Head housekeeper Meredith sent me to clean, my lord. The other maids are ill, and she said—" "She said what?" Cale stepped into the chamber and closed the door behind him with deliberate slowness. The sound of the lock engaging seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. "She said I was to be invisible," Leanna whispered, the words barely audible. Something flickered across Cale's hard features, an expression too quick to interpret, but it might have been pain. "Invisible," he repeated, and there was something almost bitter in the way he said it. He moved further into the room, and Leanna became acutely aware of how much space he occupied simply by existing. Every step he took seemed to fill the air with electric tension, as if lightning were about to strike at any moment. "And yet," Cale continued, his gaze moving past her to the reading table where the ancient book lay open, "you don't seem particularly invisible at the moment." Leanna's blood turned to ice water in her veins. He knew. Somehow he knew she had been reading his private books, violating the trust that had been placed in her. "My lord, I wasn't trying to—" "What did you read?" The question cut through her, stammering like a blade. "Nothing," she lied, the word falling flat in the charged air between them. "I don't know how to read." Kyle's laugh was soft and dangerous. "Try again." The command in his voice was impossible to resist. Leanna found herself speaking before she could think better of it, the words tumbling out in a rush of confession. "Ancient binding rituals, something about moon-blessed bloodlines and breaking curses, but I don't understand what any of it means, my lord. I swear I don't." He went very still at her words, so still that for a moment Leanna wondered if he had stopped breathing entirely. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "You read the old tongue." It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway, confusion replacing fear as the dominant emotion coursing through her system. Yes, I don't know how, but the symbols made sense when I looked at them, like remembering something I'd forgotten." Kyle moved toward her then, each step measured and deliberate. Leanna pressed herself back against the tapestry-covered wall, but there was nowhere to go. He stopped just close enough that she could smell the leather and pine scent that seemed to cling to his skin, could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. "Look at me," he commanded quietly. Leanna raised her gaze to meet his, and the same impossible recognition that had struck her in the courtyard hit again with doubled force. This close, she could see flecks of silver in his storm-grey eyes, could see the way his pupils dilated as he stared down at her with an intensity that should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like coming home. "What are you?" he asked, but the question seemed to be directed more at himself than at her. "I'm nobody," Leanna replied automatically, the response that had been beaten into her by 20 years of existing on the margins of society. "I'm nothing, my lord, just a servant." Kyle's hand rose as if to touch her face, then stopped inches from her cheek. His fingers trembled with the effort of holding back, and Leanna could see the war being fought behind his eyes. Want and duty, need and impossibility. "You're not nothing," he said finally, and his voice carried a rough edge that made something deep inside her chest flutter with dangerous hope. A crash of thunder outside broke the spell between them. Kyle stepped back abruptly, his expression shuttering closed, like armour sliding into place. The moment of impossible intimacy vanished as if it had never existed. "Finish your work," he ordered, his voice once again the cold command of a king addressing a servant. "Then leave, and tell no one you were here." He turned and strode from the chamber, leaving Leanna alone with her racing heart and the ancient book that still lay open on the reading table. But as she moved to complete her forgotten cleaning tasks, she noticed something that made her breath catch. On the small side table beside the window, a crystal the size of her fist sat in a silver holder. She had seen it when she first entered, had noted it as just another piece of the Alpha King's valuable collection. But now the crystal was glowing. Soft silver light pulsed from its core, gentle as moonlight on water. As Leanna approached, the glow intensified, responding to her proximity like a beacon recognizing its keeper. She reached out without thinking, her fingertips brushing against the smooth surface. The crystal blazed with brilliant light that filled the entire chamber, and for one impossible moment Leanna could have sworn she heard the sound of wolves howling in perfect harmony. Not the savage cry of hunters, but something else, something that sounded almost like recognition, like welcome, like coming home after a very long journey. The light faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Leanna staring at her own reflection in the now quiet crystal. But she could have sworn that for just a moment her reflection had shown silver eyes instead of her usual brown, eyes that looked very much like starlight. In the shadows of the doorway, Elder Magnus watched it all with the satisfied expression of a man whose theories had just been proven correct. The silver dawn had awakened to her power at last, and time was running out. Chapter 4. The mark revealed. The silver serving tray slipped from Leanna's trembling hands before she could stop it, crashing to the stone floor of the great hall with a sound like breaking bells. Wine splashed across the marble in dark crimson pools, staining the pristine surface that she had scrubbed to perfection just hours before. "Clumsy fool," hissed Lady Cordelia, one of the visiting nobles who had arrived for tomorrow's betrothal feast. "Can't the Northern Palace afford servants who know how to hold a tray?" Leanna dropped to her knees, frantically trying to gather the scattered goblets while her burned hand throbbed with agony. The silver had been hot from the kitchen fires, heated beyond what should have been safe for serving, but she hadn't dared complain. Servants didn't question the temperature of silver, they simply endured. But the moment the superheated metal had touched her palm, something impossible had happened. The silver had grown even hotter, as if responding to some quality in her skin, burning through flesh with the intensity of molten steel. She had felt the searing pain lance up her arm like lightning, and only years of practiced servitude had kept her from screaming. "Let me help you with that." The voice was warm with genuine kindness, so unexpected that Leanna looked up in startled surprise. Elder Magnus knelt beside her on the cold stone, his ancient hands moving with surprising dexterity as he helped gather the fallen goblets. His grey eyes were sharp with intelligence and something else that made Leanna's chest tighten with inexplicable nervousness. "You've hurt yourself," he observed quietly, his gaze falling on the hand she was trying to hide against her skirts. "It's nothing, sir," Leanna whispered, keeping her eyes downcast as she had been taught. "Just clumsy, as the lady said." Magnus's fingers closed gently around her wrist, preventing her from pulling away. "May I see?" There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, a quiet authority that reminded her of the Alpha King himself. Leanna found herself nodding, extending her injured hand with reluctance born of long experience with those who held power over her fate. The moment Magnus saw her palm, his entire body went rigid. Where the silver had burned her, a perfect crescent-shaped mark was revealed, etched into her flesh as if it had always been there. The burn had not created the mark. It had simply stripped away layers of skin to expose what lay beneath. Silver lines traced the delicate curves of a moon in its first quarter, glowing faintly with residual heat from the supernatural burn. Magnus's breath caught audibly. His fingers traced the air above the mark without quite touching, and Leanna could have sworn she felt warmth emanating from his hands, like a healer's touch. "Blessed ancestors," he whispered, and there was something like reverence in his voice. "How long have you carried this?" "I don't understand," Leanna said, confusion and fear warring in her chest. "It's just a burn, sir. It will heal." But even as she spoke, she knew that wasn't true. The crescent mark felt ancient, familiar, like something she had been born carrying but had never been able to see. And the way Magnus stared at it, as if he were looking upon something sacred, made her stomach twist with apprehension. "Where were you born?" Magnus asked urgently. "Who were your parents?" "I don't know," Leanna replied honestly. "I was brought to the palace as a baby. The kitchens have been my home for as long as I can remember." "Brought by whom?" "An old woman. That's all head cook ever told me. She said the woman claimed I was an orphan, that my parents died in the winter plagues. She left me and disappeared before dawn." Magnus's hands began to tremble as he stared at the silver mark. What was this woman's name? "I don't know that either. Head cook just called her the Grey Woman on account of her hair and cloak. She said the woman had strange eyes, silver like starlight." The last words hit Magnus like a physical blow. He rocked back on his heels, his face gone pale as winter frost. "Silver eyes," he repeated, and his voice cracked with emotion. "Sweet, merciful ancestors, it's true." "What's true?" Leanna demanded, fear beginning to override years of ingrained deference. "What are you talking about?" But before Magnus could answer, another voice cut through the great hall like a blade. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Cale Thorne strode across the marble floor with predatory grace, his storm-grey eyes taking in the scene with rapid assessment. Spilled wine, broken silver. Leanna kneeling on the floor with tears of pain streaming down her face, and Magnus, his most trusted adviser, staring at something with an expression of shock that bordered on terror. "My lord," Magnus said, scrambling to his feet with less dignity than Leanna had ever seen him display, "we need to speak privately, immediately." Kyle's gaze moved to Leanna, and she felt that same electric recognition pulse between them. But this time, something else accompanied it. A protective fury that made the air around him shimmer with barely contained violence. "You're bleeding," he stated, dropping to one knee beside her with fluid grace. "It's nothing, my lord," Leanna began, but Kyle was already reaching for her injured hand. The moment his fingers touched hers, the world exploded into sensation. Pain lanced through both of them, not the physical burn of silver against flesh, but something deeper, something that felt like two pieces of a shattered whole suddenly recognizing each other across an impossible distance. The crescent mark on Leanna's palm blazed with silver light. An answering warmth bloomed in Kyle's chest, where his own mark lay hidden beneath layers of clothing and carefully constructed armor. Kyle jerked back, as if struck by lightning, his eyes wide with shock. What? The mark of the moon blessed, Magnus whispered, his voice carrying across the great hall like a prayer. The crescent that appears only on those chosen by the ancient bloodlines. My lord, she bears the sign of royal heritage. Leanna stared at her palm, where the silver mark continued to glow with soft radiance. The pain had vanished entirely, replaced by a warmth that seemed to spread from the crescent through her entire body. I don't understand. What does this mean? Magnus looked between her and Kyle, his weathered face grave with the weight of terrible knowledge. It means, child, that everything you've been told about yourself is a lie. The words hit Leanna like a physical blow. She pushed herself to her feet, backing away from both men as panic flooded her system. No, no, I'm nobody, I'm nothing, I'm just a servant who was orphaned in the plague years. The grey woman who brought you here, Magnus continued relentlessly. Did she leave anything with you? Any token or keepsake? A necklace, Leanna admitted, her hand moving instinctively to her throat, where a simple silver chain disappeared beneath her rough servant's dress. But it's just a trinket, nothing valuable. Show me. With trembling fingers, Leanna pulled the chain from beneath her clothing. The pendant that hung from it was small and unremarkable, a simple silver disc that caught the torchlight with dull reflection. She had worn it every day for 20 years without giving it a second thought, but Magnus stared at it as if he had seen a ghost. Etched into the silver disc, so faintly that it was nearly invisible, was a coat of arms that made Cale's breath catch in recognition. A crescent moon above a howling wolf, surrounded by a border of stars. The royal seal of the Moon Crown bloodline, thought lost when the kingdom fell 3 centuries ago. Blessed ancestors preserve us, Magnus breathed. You're not just moon-blessed, child. You're the rightful heir to the Moon Crown throne. The great hall spun around Leanna as the implications crashed over her like an avalanche. Royal blood, ancient heritage, a birthright stolen and hidden for 20 years while she scrubbed floors and emptied chamber pots, believing herself to be nothing more than an unwanted orphan. That's impossible, she whispered, but even as she spoke, she felt something stirring deep inside her chest, something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Power that called to the silver mark on her palm and the ancient pendant around her neck. Cale stood slowly, his movements careful and controlled, as if he were approaching a wild creature that might bolt at any sudden motion. Leanna, he said quietly, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. Look at me. She raised her gaze to meet his and saw her own shock reflected in his storm-grey eyes. But beneath the surprise, something else burned in those depths. Recognition, acceptance, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. The prophecy, he said to Magnus, without looking away from her face. The silver dawn. She who bears the crescent mark and carries royal blood. Magnus nodded gravely. The curse can be broken, my lord. The chains that bind your bloodline to beast madness can finally be severed. But only if she chooses it, Kyle said, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had learned not to believe in salvation. Only if she's willing to risk everything for a kingdom that has never given her anything but suffering. Leanna stared at him, at this man who was both monster and king, both her salvation and her doom. The crescent mark on her palm pulsed with silver light, responding to his proximity like a compass needle finding true north. Everything she had believed about herself was crumbling away, revealing a truth she wasn't sure she was strong enough to carry. But as she looked into Cale Thorne's storm-grey eyes, she felt something she had never experienced before in her 20 years of invisible servitude. She felt important. She felt seen. For the first time in her life, she felt like she mattered, and that terrifying, wonderful sensation was going to change everything. Chapter 5. Political Poison. The great hall blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their golden flames reflecting off silver goblets and jewelled finery until the entire space seemed to shimmer with liquid fire. The betrothal feast had begun at sunset, and now the northern palace played host to the most powerful nobles from across the kingdom, all gathered to witness the political alliance that would secure peace between the northern territories and the southern courts. Lyanna moved through the celebration like a shadow, her silver serving tray balanced carefully in hands that no longer trembled. The crescent mark on her palm had healed completely, leaving only the faintest trace of silver lines that seemed to glow when the light caught them just right. She kept her hand carefully hidden beneath her sleeve, acutely aware that Magnus's revelation had changed everything and nothing all at once. She was still a servant, still invisible, still expected to pour wine and clear plates while her betters celebrated a union that would bind Cale Thorne to a woman who was everything Lyanna would never be. Lady Isadora Blackthorne sat at the high table beside the Alpha King, resplendent in midnight blue silk that matched her raven hair. Sapphires glittered at her throat and wrists, each stone worth more than Lyanna would earn in a lifetime of service. She was beautiful in the way that noble women were trained to be beautiful, perfectly arranged, flawlessly presented, every gesture calculated for maximum political impact. And she was Cale's intended bride. Lyanna forced herself to focus on her duties, weaving between tables laden with roasted meats and exotic delicacies that had been imported from the far corners of the kingdom. But no matter how hard she tried to remain invisible, she couldn't escape the magnetic pull of the high table, where Kyle sat like a king carved from storm clouds and starlight. He looked magnificent in his formal attire, black leather and silver chainmail that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the deadly grace with which he moved. His dark hair had been pulled back from his face, revealing the sharp angles of his features and those storm-grey eyes that seemed to see everything and forgive nothing. But Lyanna could see the tension in the rigid line of his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched whenever Lady Isadora leaned too close or placed her perfectly manicured hand on his arm. He was playing a role tonight just as surely as Lyanna was playing hers. The difference was that his role would last a lifetime. "To the union of North and South," declared Lord Blackthorne, Isadora's father, raising his goblet high above his head. "May this alliance bring prosperity to both our houses and strength to the kingdom." The assembled nobles raised their own goblets in response, their voices joining in the traditional toast that sealed political marriages across the realm. But as the ritual words echoed through the great hall, Lyanna found herself looking directly at Kyle, and their gazes met across the crowded space with the same electric recognition that had haunted her dreams for days. For one impossible moment, the celebration faded away entirely. The noise of the feast became distant thunder. The flickering candlelight dimmed until only the silver glow that seemed to emanate from her palm remained. In that suspended instant, she could have sworn she felt something flow between them, warm and golden and alive, like sunlight given substance. Then someone stepped between them, breaking the connection, and reality crashed back with brutal force. "More wine, girl." Lady Isadora's voice cut through the ambient noise like a blade, sharp with the casual cruelty that came so naturally to those born to power. "And try not to spill it this time." Lyanna approached the high table with careful steps, her heart hammering against her ribs as she poured wine into Lady Isadora's goblet. This close, she could smell the woman's perfume, something exotic and expensive that spoke of distant courts and political influence. This close, she could also see the calculating intelligence that burned in Isadora's dark blue eyes, intelligence that was currently focused on her with uncomfortable intensity. "You're the clumsy one from yesterday," Isadora observed, her voice pitched low enough that only Leanna could hear. "The one who broke the silver tray." "Yes, my lady," Leanna replied quietly, keeping her gaze fixed on the wine she was pouring. "And you were injured, I heard. A burn that required the attention of Elder Magnus himself." Something cold twisted in Leanna's stomach. There was too much interest in Isadora's tone, too much focus on details that should have been beneath a noble's notice. "It was nothing, my lady, just a small accident." Isadora's hand moved faster than a striking snake, closing around Leanna's wrist with surprising strength. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into flesh as she turned Leanna's palm up to the light, searching for evidence of the burn that should have left scars. But the crescent mark was hidden beneath a carefully applied mixture of kitchen soot and lard that Magnus had provided, disguised as ordinary dirt that no noble would look at twice. "How curious," Isadora murmured, her grip tightening, until Leanna had to bite back a gasp of pain. "Burns from superheated silver usually leave permanent marks, yet your skin looks perfectly unblemished." "I heal quickly, my lady," Leanna managed, trying to pull her hand free without making a scene. "Do you indeed?" Isadora's smile was sharp as winter frost. "How very interesting." She released Leanna's wrist with a gesture that looked casual but felt like a threat. "You may go, but do be careful with the wine tonight. It would be such a shame if someone were to have an accident." The words sent ice through Leanna's veins, but she managed a curtsy and backed away from the high table without incident. As she retreated into the crowd of celebrating nobles, she caught Cale's eye once more and saw her own unease reflected in his storm-grey gaze. He had heard the exchange, had seen Isadora's examination of her hand, and from the dangerous stillness that had settled over him, he understood exactly what it meant. Lady Isadora suspected something, and that made Leanna a threat to be eliminated. The feast continued for hours, wine flowing like water and laughter echoing off the stone walls until the great hall rang with celebration. But beneath the surface gaiety, Leanna could feel tension building like storm pressure in the air before lightning strikes. She completed her duties mechanically, clearing plates and refilling goblets, while her mind raced through the implications of Isadora's interest. The woman was no fool. That much was clear from the calculating way she had examined Leanna's supposedly burned hand. If she suspected that something supernatural had occurred, if she had any inkling of what Magnus had discovered. By the time the feast wound down and the nobles began retiring to their chambers, Leanna's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. She made her way through the servants' corridors toward her own small room, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of political manoeuvring and veiled threats. She never saw the figure waiting in the shadows of her doorway. The attack came without warning. A cloth pressed over her mouth and nose, soaked with something that made her vision blur and her knees buckle. She tried to fight, tried to scream, but the chemical scent filled her lungs and dragged her down into darkness. The last thing she saw before consciousness fled was a pair of dark blue eyes watching her fall with cold satisfaction. When Leanna awoke, it was to agony beyond anything she had ever experienced. Fire burned through her veins like molten silver, each heartbeat sending fresh waves of pain cascading through her body. Her stomach cramped with violent spasms, and bile rose in her throat with the bitter taste of poison. Someone had drugged her wine, the wine that had been waiting in her room, the wine that should have been safe in the servants' quarters where no noble would ever venture. She tried to call for help, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper. Her vision swam with dark spots that threatened to pull her back into unconsciousness, and she could feel her heartbeat growing erratic as the poison did its work. This was how she would die, alone in a servant's room, murdered by political necessity, while the palace slept around her in blissful ignorance. But even as despair threatened to claim her, something else stirred in her chest. The same warmth that had pulsed between her and Kyle during their moment of connection in the great hall, only now it blazed with desperate intensity. The crescent mark on her palm began to glow through its disguise of soot and lard, silver light piercing the darkness of her small chamber. And somewhere in the palace above, Cale Thorne bolted upright in his own bed as pain that was not his own lanced through his chest like a dagger. The mate bond had awakened at last, and it was screaming. Chapter 6. Dangerous Proximity. Cale Thorne moved through the palace corridors like death-given form, his bare feet silent against the cold stone as he followed the burning thread of pain that connected him to Lyanna's agony. The mate bond blazed in his chest like molten silver, each pulse of her suffering driving him closer to the edge of transformation. Behind him, his abandoned betrothal chamber told the story of his abrupt departure. Silk sheets thrown aside, formal clothing discarded in his desperate haste to reach her. Lady Isadora would wake to find her intended husband gone, fled in the middle of the night like a thief abandoning his post. Let her wake. Let the entire palace discover his transgression. Nothing mattered except the pain tearing through his chest, pain that belonged to the servant girl who carried royal blood and bore the mark of his salvation. He found her door standing open, Elder Magnus already kneeling beside the narrow bed where Lyanna writhed in the grip of poison-induced fever. The old healer's hands glowed with soft blue light as he worked, calling upon healing magic that few in the kingdom still remembered how to wield. "Nightshade and silver dust," Magnus reported without looking up, his voice grim with professional assessment. "Mixed with something else I can't identify. Whoever did this wanted her death to look natural, a servant girl succumbing to sudden illness, nothing more." Kyle dropped to his knees beside the bed, his wolf raging just beneath the surface of his skin. The scent of poison hung heavy in the small chamber, but underneath it he caught something else that made his blood run cold. A familiar perfume, exotic and expensive, clinging to the empty wine goblet on Lyanna's bedside table. Isadora had been here. "How long does she have?" he demanded, his voice rough with barely contained violence. "Without intervention? Hours, perhaps less." Magnus's healing light intensified as he worked. But the poison wasn't prepared for someone of her bloodline. The moon-blessed heritage is fighting back, trying to burn the toxins from her system. As if responding to his words, the crescent mark on Lyanna's palm began to glow through its disguise of soot and lard. Silver light pulsed in rhythm with her laboured heartbeat, and Kyle felt answering warmth bloom in his own chest, where his mate mark lay hidden beneath layers of clothing and carefully constructed armour. "She's calling to you," Magnus observed quietly. "The bond recognises her distress and seeks comfort from her other half." Kyle reached out with trembling fingers, brushing a strand of damp hair back from Lyanna's fevered brow. The moment his skin touched hers, the mate bond flared with such intensity that both of them gasped, her eyes flying open to reveal pupils dilated with pain and poison, his own vision whitening around the edges as their connection deepened beyond anything he had thought possible. "Kyle," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer torn from dying breath. "I'm here," he replied, his thumb tracing gentle patterns against her temple. "I'm here, and I'm not leaving." For 48 hours he kept that promise. The palace buzzed with scandal as news of the Alpha King's vigil spread through the corridors like wildfire. Lord Blackthorne demanded explanations that Kyle refused to provide. Lady Isadora alternated between cold fury and calculated concern, playing the role of the worried betrothed while privately seething at this public humiliation. But Kyle remained beside Lyanna's bed, tending to her with a devotion that shocked even Magnus. He held goblets of healing tea to her cracked lips, supporting her head when violent spasms racked her body. He bathed her fevered skin with cool cloths and whispered words of comfort in the old tongue. ancient phrases that seemed to ease her suffering even when she was too deep in delirium to understand their meaning. On the second night, as her fever reached its peak and her breathing grew shallow enough to terrify even Magnus, she began to speak. The words that fell from her lips were not the common tongue spoken throughout the kingdom, nor even the formal court language used in diplomatic ceremonies. They were older than both, syllables that seemed to carry the weight of centuries and the power of forgotten bloodlines. "Selenai Morvaithis," she murmured, her voice taking on a musical quality that raised the hair on Kyle's arms. "Lunaras thol menethil, Vaithis mor Selenai." Magnus went rigid beside the bed, his weathered face paling as recognition dawned. "Blessed ancestors," he breathed. "That's the invocation of Queen Selena herself, the prayer for the moon's protection that only the royal bloodline knew." "What does it mean?" Kyle demanded, never taking his eyes off Lyanna's face. "By Selene's grace we are protected," Magnus translated reverently. "By Luna's light we are guided, protected by Selene's grace." It's the formal prayer of the Moon Crown royalty, spoken only in times of greatest need. As if responding to the translation, Lyanna's breathing began to steady. The silver light emanating from her crescent mark grew brighter, and Kyle felt the mate bond pulse with renewed strength. Whatever poison had been burning through her system was finally losing the battle against her awakening heritage. "She's going to survive," Magnus said, wonder creeping into his voice. "The royal blood is stronger than whoever tried to kill her anticipated." Relief crashed over Kyle with such force that his carefully maintained control finally shattered. His head dropped to rest beside Lyanna's on the narrow pillow, and for the first time since childhood, tears burned behind his eyes. She was going to live. His mate, his salvation, the impossible girl who carried the power to break his curse. She was going to survive this attempt on her life. But even as gratitude flooded his system, rage followed close behind. Someone had tried to murder her. Someone had looked at this brave, beautiful woman and decided that her death was politically expedient. And he had a very good idea who that someone was. "My lord," Magnus said carefully, clearly reading the dangerous shift in Kyle's emotional state. "Perhaps you should rest. Lady Isadora has been asking for you and—" "Let her ask," Kyle snarled, his wolf rising to the surface with predatory intent. "Let her explain to her father why I abandoned our betrothal bed to tend a servant girl. Let her try to justify the scent of her perfume on a poisoned wine goblet." Magnus's eyes widened with understanding. "You think she did this?" "I know she did this." Kyle's hand moved to rest over Lyanna's, where the crescent mark continued to glow beneath its disguise. "The question is whether I kill her for it, or simply exile her back to the southern courts in disgrace." "My lord, you cannot simply—" "I can do whatever I damn well please," Kyle interrupted, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha who had reached the end of his patience. "I am the king of these lands, and someone just tried to murder my—" He stopped abruptly, the words dying on his lips as their implications crashed over him. His what? His mate? His destined queen? The woman whose touch could break a 3-century curse and whose death would damn him to eternal beast madness? All of those things were true, but none of them were things he could say aloud, not with political alliances hanging in the balance and the fate of 2 kingdoms depending on a marriage he no longer wanted to honour. "You're what, my lord?" Magnus prompted gently. Kyle looked down at Lyanna's sleeping face, peaceful now that the worst of the poison had been purged from her system. In sleep, she looked even younger than her 20 years, vulnerable in a way that made his chest ache with protective fury. "Mine," he said finally, and the simple word carried the weight of absolute truth. "She's mine, Magnus, and I will burn this kingdom to ash before I let anyone hurt her again." On the bed, Lyanna stirred at the sound of his voice, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal brown eyes that were clearer than they had been in days. When she saw him sitting beside her, the faintest smile curved her lips. "You stayed," she whispered, wonder colouring her voice. "I promised I would," Kyle replied, his thumbs stroking across her knuckles where their hands remained joined. But the betrothal, Lady Isadora, the political alliance, none of that matters. The words came out rougher than he intended, weighted with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. You matter, Lyanna. You're what matters. She stared at him with those luminous brown eyes, searching his face for some sign that this was all another fever-induced dream. But the mate bond thrummed between them with steady warmth, and the silver mark on her palm pulsed in rhythm with his own heartbeat. "I don't understand," she said softly. "Why would the Alpha King care what happens to a servant girl?" Kyle lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm where the crescent mark lay hidden beneath its careful disguise. "Because you're not just a servant girl," he murmured against her skin, "and I'm not just a king. We're something else entirely, something that was written in the stars long before either of us drew breath." Outside her chamber window, dawn was breaking over the northern palace, painting the sky in shades of silver and gold. But for the first time in his adult life, Cale Thorne wasn't thinking about the sunrise or the duties it would bring. He was thinking about the woman whose hand fit perfectly in his, and the way her presence made the curse-driven beast in his chest settle into contentment for the first time in years. Political alliances be damned. He had found his mate, and he was never letting her go. Chapter 7. The Wolf's Choice. Lyanna woke to the sensation of warm breath against her cheek and the comforting weight of something massive pressed against the side of her narrow bed. Her eyelids fluttered open, expecting to find Kyle sitting in the chair where he had maintained his vigil for the past 3 days. Instead, she found herself staring into eyes like molten silver, pupils that held far too much intelligence for any ordinary beast. The black wolf lying beside her bed was enormous, easily the size of a small horse, with fur so dark it seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflect it. Scars crisscrossed his muzzle and flanks, telling stories of battles fought and won through sheer brutal force. This was the creature that had terrorized the eastern provinces, the monster that enemy armies whispered about in their nightmares. But as Lyanna met his gaze, she felt no fear. The wolf's massive head rested on his front paws, positioned so that he was eye level with her as she lay recovering from the poison's effects. His ears were pricked forward in an attitude of alert protectiveness, and she could see the rise and fall of his powerful chest as he breathed in perfect rhythm with her own heartbeat. "Kyle," she whispered, and the wolf's ears twitched in response to his name. He had been here all night in this form, she realized, watching over her while she slept, standing guard against any who might try to harm her again. The thought should have terrified her, being alone with the beast of the north in his most dangerous form, with no one to hear her scream if his predatory instincts took over. Instead, she felt safer than she had ever felt in her 20 years of life. Moving slowly so as not to startle him, Lyanna extended her hand toward the wolf's massive head. Every logical part of her mind screamed warnings about touching a predator that could tear her throat out without effort, but something deeper than logic guided her movements, something that felt like coming home. The moment her palm touched the coarse fur between his ears, the world exploded into sensation. Silver light blazed from the crescent mark on her hand, so brilliant that it turned the small chamber into a constellation of stars. But this time the light didn't burn. It warmed, spreading from her palm through every nerve ending until she felt like she was glowing from within. The wolf beneath her touch went rigid, a low whine escaping his throat as the light washed over him. But it wasn't pain that made him tremble. It was relief so profound that Lyanna could feel it echoing through her own chest like a physical force. For the first time in years, the curse-driven rage that constantly clawed at the edges of Cale's consciousness went quiet. The beast madness that had been growing stronger with each passing moon simply stopped. In its place, there was peace, wholeness, the feeling of two broken pieces finally finding their perfect match. "Oh," Lyanna breathed, wonder colouring her voice as understanding crashed over her in waves. "You're not a monster at all, are you?" The wolf, Kyle, lifted his great head to study her face with those intelligent silver eyes. Then, moving with careful deliberation, he pressed his muzzle against her palm where the crescent mark continued to glow with gentle radiance. The transformation began immediately. Lyanna watched in fascination as bones cracked and reformed, as the massive wolf form condensed and shifted until Cale Thorne knelt beside her bed in human shape once more. But something fundamental had changed. The lines of constant pain that had bracketed his mouth were gone. The shadows that usually haunted his storm-grey eyes had lifted, leaving behind a clarity she had never seen before. "How?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion as he stared at her glowing palm. "How is this possible?" "I don't know," Lyanna replied honestly. "But when I touched you, I could feel it, the thing that was hurting you. It's quiet now." Cale's hands trembled as he reached for her, cupping her face with a reverence that made her breath catch. "Do you understand what this means?" he whispered. "For 300 years, my bloodline has carried the curse of beast madness. Every generation has lost more humanity until we become monsters that can never return to human form. But your touch silences it completely." The implications washed over Lyanna like a tide. She wasn't just a servant girl with hidden royal blood. She was the key to breaking a curse that had tormented an entire bloodline for centuries. The silver dawn that Magnus had spoken of in whispered reverence. "The prophecy," she said, understanding dawning like sunrise in her voice. "The prophecy," Kyle confirmed, his thumb stroking across her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "But only if you choose it, Lyanna, only if you're willing to accept what you are and what we could be together." Before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside her chamber. Multiple sets of boots, moving with military precision, accompanied by the rustle of expensive silk that could only belong to nobility. Kyle was on his feet in an instant, positioning himself between Lyanna and the door with fluid grace. His hand moved instinctively to the sword that wasn't there. He had been in wolf form after all, with no need for human weapons. The door burst open without ceremony, revealing a sight that made Lyanna's heart sink into her stomach. Lady Isadora stood in the doorway, flanked by her father's guards, her perfect features arranged in an expression of wounded betrayal that looked entirely too genuine. "So it's true," Isadora said, her voice carrying across the small chamber with crystalline clarity. The great Alpha King, abandoning his betrothed to tend a servant girl like some lovesick fool. "Careful, Isadora," Kyle warned, his voice carrying the dangerous edge that had made enemy armies flee in terror. "You're speaking to your king." "Am I?" Isadora stepped into the chamber, her midnight blue gown rustling around her like storm clouds. "Because from where I stand, it looks like I'm speaking to a man who has forgotten every duty and honour that makes him worthy of a crown." Behind her, Lord Blackthorne entered with the cold fury of a man whose political alliance had just crumbled into dust. His pale eyes swept the intimate scene, Cale's rumpled clothing, Lyanna's obvious illness, the unmistakable scent of healing magic that still lingered in the air. 3 days, Lord Blackthorne said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. 3 days you've been absent from your betrothal obligations, ignoring your intended bride to play nursemaid to this. His gaze fell on Lyanna with such obvious disdain that she instinctively pressed herself back against the wall. In her rough servant's dress, with her tangled hair and fever-pale skin, she knew exactly what she looked like to these powerful nobles. Nothing. Nobody. A momentary distraction that had somehow bewitched their king. "This," Kyle said with deadly quiet, "is none of your concern, Blackthorne. What happens in my kingdom with my people is my decision alone." "Your people?" Isadora laughed, and there was genuine cruelty in the sound. "Is that what you call bedding servants now? Taking care of your people?" The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Lyanna felt heat flood her cheeks as the implications became clear. They thought, they believed that she and Kyle had... "Nothing happened," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was ill, and His Majesty was kind enough to—" "Silence," Lord Blackthorne snapped. "Servants do not speak in the presence of their betters." But Kyle moved faster than thought, positioning himself squarely between Lyanna and the hostile nobles. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of an alpha who had reached the end of his patience. "She will speak whenever she chooses," he said with lethal calm, "and you will address her with respect, or you will find yourselves in the dungeons explaining your discourtesy to my guards." The threat was unmistakable, and Lord Blackthorne took an involuntary step backward. But Isidora held her ground, her dark blue eyes blazing with the kind of fury that came from wounded pride and shattered ambition. "You would threaten noble guests for a servant?" she demanded. "You would break a political alliance that has been months in the making, risk war between North and South, all for what? A pretty face that caught your attention." "I would do far more than that," Kyle replied, and something in his tone made the temperature in the room seem to drop by several degrees. "Try to understand your position here, Lady Isidora. You are a guest in my palace, subject to my laws and my mercy. The fact that we were betrothed gives you no right to question my decisions or insult those under my protection." "Were?" Isidora's voice cracked like a whip. "Were betrothed? Are you dissolving our engagement over a servant girl?" Kyle turned slightly, his storm-grey gaze meeting Lyanna's across the charged space of the small chamber. In his eyes she saw the same recognition that had been building between them for days, the knowledge that they were something more than king and subject, something that transcended politics and duty and the expectations of their respective stations. "Yes," he said simply, and the single word carried the weight of absolute truth. "I am." The silence that followed was deafening. Lord Blackthorne's face went purple with rage, while Isidora stared at Kyle as if he had just announced his intention to burn the kingdom to ash. "You're making a mistake," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her eyes. "A mistake that will cost both our kingdoms dearly." "Perhaps," Kyle acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head, "but it will be my mistake to make." As the hostile nobles retreated from the chamber, their threats and ultimatums echoing in the corridor beyond, Lyanna found herself alone, with Kyle once more. But everything had changed. The careful distance they had maintained, the political impossibility of their connection, all of it had been swept away by his public declaration. "You chose me," she said, wonder and terror warring in her voice. "I chose us," Kyle corrected, moving back to her bedside with the fluid grace that never seemed to leave him. "I chose what we could be together, rather than what duty demanded I become alone." He took her hand in his, careful of her healing injuries, and Lyanna felt the mate bond pulse between them with renewed strength. The crescent mark on her palm glowed softly, responding to his touch like a compass needle finding true north. "But the political alliance," she protested, "the risk of war—" "Will be dealt with as they arise," Kyle said firmly. "I have been Alpha King for 8 years, Lyanna. I have fought wars and negotiated treaties and made the hard decisions that keep this kingdom safe. I can handle Lord Blackthorne and his wounded pride. And if you can't?" Kale's smile was sharp as winter frost, carrying just a hint of the predator that lived beneath his human skin. "Then they'll learn why the eastern provinces still whisper about the beast of the north in their nightmares." Despite everything, the political chaos, the threats, the impossible situation they now found themselves in, Lyanna felt herself smiling in response. For the first time in her 20 years of invisible servitude, someone had chosen her. Not just tolerated her presence or found her useful, but actively chosen her over duty, over politics, over the easy path that would have kept everyone happy. The Alpha King had chosen her, and in doing so, he had changed both their fates forever. Chapter 8. The Challenge Issued. The War Council chamber had not witnessed such tension in decades. Ancient tapestries depicting battles long won seemed to watch with woven eyes as the most powerful nobles in the kingdom arranged themselves around the massive oak table, their faces etched with varying degrees of outrage and political calculation. Cale Thorne sat at the head of the table like a king carved from storm clouds, his storm-grey eyes moving with predatory assessment over the assembled lords who had demanded this emergency session. To his right, Elder Magnus maintained the careful neutrality of a counsellor who had served 3 generations of rulers. To his left sat an empty chair, the place that should have been occupied by his betrothed bride. Lady Isadora Blackthorne stood before them all, magnificent in her fury and humiliation. Her midnight blue gown was perfectly arranged, her raven hair immaculately styled, every detail of her appearance calculated to remind everyone present of exactly what Cale was throwing away. "Let me ensure I understand the situation correctly," Lord Commander Hayes said, his weathered face grim with disapproval. "You are dissolving a betrothal that took months to negotiate, risking war with the Southern Territories, all for a servant girl who claims noble blood based on nothing more than a birthmark." "The mark of the moon-blessed is not nothing more than a birthmark," Magnus interjected quietly. "It is a sign that appears only on those chosen by the ancient bloodlines, and Lady Lyanna's heritage has been thoroughly documented through genealogical research." "Lady Lyanna," Lord Blackthorne's voice dripped with disdain. "You would grant noble titles to kitchen servants now. What's next, Magnus? Shall we crown the stable boys and make duchesses of the scullery maids?" Cale's hands clenched into fists on the table's surface, and several of the assembled nobles took involuntary steps backward as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You will speak of her with respect," he said in a voice like winter thunder, "or you will not speak at all." "Respect?" Lady Isadora laughed, and there was genuine venom in the sound. "For the servant girl who has bewitched our king, the little whore who spread her legs and convinced you to abandon duty for lust." The words had barely left her lips before Kyle was on his feet, moving with the deadly grace that had made him legend on a dozen battlefields. But before he could reach the woman who had just insulted his mate, Magnus's voice cut through the charged air with quiet authority. "Lady Isadora," the elder said with dangerous calm, "I would recommend withdrawing that statement immediately. The bloodline that flows through Lyanna's veins is older than your house, older than this kingdom, older than the very stones of this palace. She is the rightful heir to the moon-crowned throne, descendant of Queen Selene herself. If you insult her again, you will be insulting royalty that outranks us all." The silence that followed was deafening. Several lords shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the implications of Magnus's words, even if they didn't want to accept them. The moon-crowned bloodline was the stuff of legend, the royal house that had ruled when magic flowed freely through the land and wolves ran as equals beside their human counterparts. If Lyanna truly carried that heritage— "Prove it," Lord Blackthorne demanded, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been fear. "If this servant girl is truly royalty, let her demonstrate powers beyond those of common-born magic users. Let her show us why we should believe these impossible claims." "The full moon rises tomorrow night," Isadora added, her dark blue eyes glittering with malicious calculation. "If she is truly moon-blessed, if she carries the power of the ancient bloodlines, then let her prove it when Luna's light is at its strongest." Something cold twisted in Cale's stomach as he recognized the trap being laid. The full moon, the night when his curse would reach its peak, when the beast madness would either be broken forever or claim him permanently. They wanted to force Lyanna into a public demonstration of power at the exact moment when failure would cost him his humanity. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Isadora's smile was sharp as a blade. A formal challenge. If this servant girl truly believes herself worthy of a king's love, if she thinks her supposed royal blood gives her the right to break treaties and shatter alliances, then let her prove it in combat. Combat? Magnus's voice cracked with disbelief. Lyanna has no formal training in warfare. She's a healer by nature, not a warrior. Then perhaps she shouldn't have aimed so high above her station, Isidora replied with cold satisfaction. The law of formal challenge is ancient and binding, Elder Magnus. Any noble may dispute another's claim to status or position through trial by combat. If Lyanna of no name truly believes herself worthy of the Alpha King's hand, she can face me in the old circle tomorrow night. Kyle felt his wolf surge to the surface, claws elongating from his fingernails as rage coursed through his system. Absolutely not! I will not allow— You will not allow, Lord Blackthorne interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of legal precedent. My lord, the law of formal challenge supersedes even royal authority when questions of bloodline legitimacy arise. If the girl claims Mooncrown heritage, she must be prepared to defend that claim with her life. The challenge has been issued before witnesses, Lord Commander Hayes added reluctantly. By law, it must be answered within 24 hours, or the claim is forfeit by default. The trap closed around them with the inexorable weight of legal tradition. Kyle could see it in the satisfied expressions of his political enemies, could feel it in the tension that suddenly filled the War Council chamber. They had manoeuvred Lyanna into an impossible position, accept the challenge and face almost certain death at the hands of a trained warrior, or refuse and lose any claim to the royal heritage that was her birthright. I accept. The voice came from the chamber's entrance, clear and steady, despite the tremor of fear that underlay it. Every head turned to see Lyanna standing in the doorway, her chin raised with quiet dignity that would have befitted a queen. She had changed from her servant's dress into a simple but well-fitted gown that Magnus had provided, and the silver pendant bearing the moon-crowned seal glinted at her throat in the torchlight. Lyanna, Kyle said, moving toward her with desperate urgency. You don't understand what you're agreeing to. Isidora is a trained fighter, born and bred to combat. She'll kill you. Perhaps, Lyanna replied, with a calmness that made his chest ache. But I won't dishonour the bloodline that flows through my veins by cowering from a challenge to its legitimacy. She stepped into the chamber, and Kyle could see the way the silver pendant at her throat seemed to glow faintly in response to her proximity to the ancient stones of the palace. The crescent mark on her palm, hidden beneath a simple glove, pulsed with warmth that he could feel through their mate bond. The challenge is accepted, she announced formally, her voice carrying to every corner of the War Council chamber. Lady Isidora Blackthorne, I will meet you in the old circle tomorrow night at moonrise, and we will settle this matter according to the ancient laws. Isidora's smile was triumphant and cold. Excellent. I look forward to demonstrating the difference between true nobility and pretenders who reach above their station. As the council began to disperse, making preparations for the formal combat that would take place in less than 24 hours, Kyle remained frozen in place. The woman he loved, his mate, his salvation, had just agreed to face a trained killer in single combat with no weapons but her untested heritage and no protection but his faith in her abilities. If she lost, she would die. And if she died, the curse would claim him forever, transforming him into the beast that would eventually destroy everything he had sworn to protect. But even worse than that, if she died, he would lose the first person in his adult life who had looked at him and seen something worth saving instead of something to be feared. The full moon was rising, and time was running out for them all. Magnus approached with careful steps, his weathered face grave with concern. My lord, there may be a way to prepare her. The ancient rituals, the awakening ceremonies that unlocked power in the Mooncrown bloodline, if we can access even a fraction of her heritage before tomorrow night. Do it, Kyle commanded without hesitation. Whatever it takes, whatever the risk, help her find the power that lives in her blood, because if we fail—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Magnus understood the stakes as well as anyone. Tomorrow night would determine not just Lyanna's survival, but the fate of the curse that had plagued the northern bloodline for 3 centuries. Everything hinged on whether a servant girl, who had just learned of her royal heritage, could awaken enough power to defeat a warrior who had been trained to kill since childhood, and they had less than a day to make it possible. Chapter 9. Ancient Power Awakening. The sacred grove lay hidden in the deepest heart of the northern palace grounds, where ancient oaks had stood sentinel for centuries, and moonlight filtered through leaves that whispered secrets in tongues older than kingdoms. Here, in this place where the veil between worlds grew thin, Elder Magnus had prepared the ritual that would either awaken Lyanna's dormant heritage or destroy her in the attempt. Candles arranged in a perfect crescent circle cast dancing shadows across the grove's floor, their silver flames responding to magic that hummed in the very air around them. At the circle's centre stood an altar carved from moonstone, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. Lyanna approached the altar with steps that felt heavier with each passing moment. The simple white robe Magnus had provided rustled around her ankles, and the moon-crown pendant at her throat seemed to grow warmer as she neared the ancient stone. Behind her, Kyle paced the grove's perimeter like a caged wolf, his storm-grey eyes never leaving her face. "Are you certain about this?" he asked for the 10th time, his voice rough with barely controlled fear. "The awakening ritual hasn't been performed in over 2 centuries. Magnus is working from texts that may be incomplete, and if something goes wrong—" "If something goes wrong, I die tonight instead of tomorrow," Lyanna replied, with a calmness she didn't entirely feel. "At least this way, I face death trying to become what I was born to be." Magnus looked up from the ancient tome he'd been consulting, his weathered face grave with the weight of terrible knowledge. "The ritual will be painful," he said carefully. "The moon-crown bloodline was suppressed in you from birth, buried so deeply that even you were unaware of its existence. Awakening that power will require breaking barriers that have been in place for 20 years. "I understand," Lyanna said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. How could anyone truly understand what it meant to have their fundamental nature rewritten in the space of a single night? "No," Magnus continued relentlessly, "you don't. The pain will be unlike anything you've ever experienced. Your bones will crack and reform as your body adapts to containing royal magic. Your blood will burn like molten silver as it awakens to its true nature, and there's no guarantee that you'll survive the transformation intact." The words hung in the grove's charged air like a death sentence. But Lyanna had already made her choice, had committed herself to this path the moment she accepted Isadora's challenge. There was no turning back now, not with the full moon rising and Kyle's curse reaching its breaking point. "Begin the ritual," she said firmly, stepping into the crescent circle of candles. Magnus nodded reluctantly, moving to stand before the moonstone altar with the reverence of a priest conducting last rites. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the ancient tome to a page covered with symbols that seemed to glow within a light. "Lyanna, descendant of Luna, heir to the moon-crown throne," he began in the formal cadence of ritual invocation. "You stand before the altar of your ancestors, seeking to reclaim the power that was stolen from your bloodline. Are you prepared to pay the price that awakening demands?" "I am," Lyanna replied, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to choke her. "Then remove the pendant and place it upon the altar. Let the seal of your house bear witness to what transpires here tonight." With trembling fingers, Lyanna lifted the silver chain over her head and placed the moon-crown pendant on the moonstone surface. The moment the ancient seal touched the altar, light blazed from its surface with such intensity that both men had to shield their eyes. The ritual began immediately. Power slammed into Lyanna like a physical blow, driving her to her knees as pain unlike anything she had ever imagined tore through her body. It felt as if every bone was breaking and reforming simultaneously, as if her blood had been replaced with liquid fire that burned through her veins with merciless intensity. But this was only the beginning. Ancient words poured from Magnus's lips in the old tongue, syllables that carried the weight of centuries and the power of forgotten bloodlines. As he spoke, the symbols on the altar began to glow brighter, and Lyanna felt something deep inside her chest responding to the call of her heritage. Her wolf was awakening. The beast that had lain dormant within her for 20 years stretched and stirred, pressing against barriers that had been carefully constructed to keep it sleeping. As those barriers began to crack under the ritual's pressure, Lyanna screamed, a sound that started human and ended as something altogether wilder. "Fight it!" Kyle commanded from the circle's edge, his own wolf responding to her distress with protective fury. "Don't let the pain drag you under. Remember what you're fighting for." But the agony was beyond anything she had prepared herself to endure. Her spine arched as bones cracked and elongated, preparing her body for a transformation she had never experienced. Her fingernails extended into claws that dug furrows in the grove's soft earth, and when she opened her mouth to scream again, fangs had replaced her human teeth. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the flood of memories that came with the awakening. Suddenly, Lyanna could see through the eyes of her ancestors. She experienced Queen Celine's final moments as Aldrich Thorne's forces overran the Mooncrown capital, felt the dying queen's rage and despair as she pronounced the curse that would haunt his bloodline for centuries. She lived through Princess Luna's desperate flight into the frozen north, carrying her infant daughter and the last hope of their royal line. Generation after generation of hidden descendants flashed through her consciousness, each one carrying the suppressed power of the Mooncrown bloodline, each one forced to live in obscurity while their true nature remained buried. She felt their longing, their sense of incompleteness, the way they had all searched for something they couldn't name. And finally she understood what she was, not just a servant girl with noble blood, not just a descendant of ancient royalty. She was the culmination of centuries of careful breeding and magical preparation, the one chosen by fate itself to restore balance to a world thrown into chaos by betrayal and murder. She was the Silver Dawn, and it was time to embrace what that truly meant. The transformation reached its climax as the full moon crested the tops of the ancient oaks, bathing the grove in ethereal light that seemed to flow directly into Lyanna's changing form. Her human shape dissolved in a cascade of silver radiance, bones and muscle reforming according to a pattern written in starlight and destiny. When the light finally faded, a wolf unlike any other stood within the crescent circle. Lyanna's wolf form was magnificent and terrible, her fur the pure silver of moonlight on water, her eyes blazing with the accumulated power of the Mooncrown bloodline. She was larger than any normal wolf, nearly matching Cale's beast form in size, but where his presence spoke of barely controlled violence, hers radiated ancient authority that made the very air around her shimmer with reverence. Magnus fell to his knees before her, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he witnessed the fulfillment of prophecies he had studied for decades. "Blessed ancestors," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, "the Silver Dawn has returned at last." But it was Cale's reaction that made Lyanna's newly awakened heart soar with fierce joy. His massive black wolf materialized beside her as if summoned by her transformation, and when their eyes met across the grove, she felt their mate bond complete itself with a resonance that shook the very foundations of the earth. His wolf recognized hers not just as an equal, but as something more, something that carried the authority to command even the beast of the north, something that could gentle his savage nature and guide his fury toward worthy targets. For the first time in his adult life, Chaol's wolf submitted completely to another's will, not out of defeat or coercion, but out of recognition that he had finally found his true queen. They ran together through the midnight forest, two wolves moving in perfect harmony beneath the full moon's blessing. Lyanna revelled in the power that flowed through her newly awakened form, in the way the trees seemed to bow in her presence, and the very earth responded to her footsteps with sprouting flowers. This was what she had been born for. This was the destiny that had been stolen from her in infancy and hidden for 20 years while she scrubbed floors and served those who should have been bowing to her. But as dawn approached and they returned to the grove, where Magnus waited with healing salves and fresh clothes, Lyanna felt the weight of what lay ahead settling on her shoulders like a mantle of destiny. The ritual was complete. Her power had awakened. The curse that had plagued Chaol's bloodline showed signs of weakening under the influence of their completed bond. But Lady Isadora still waited in the old circle, and the challenge could not be avoided. Tonight, when the moon rose full and bright above the palace grounds, Lyanna would face her destiny in single combat. And everything they had fought for, everything they had discovered about themselves and each other, would be decided by tooth and claw under the ancient laws that governed their kind. The silver dawn had awakened at last. Now it remained to be seen whether she was strong enough to survive what came next.